Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Passages Pulse. Today is Wednesday, November 12th, 2025. It is 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you for watching. I hope you're staying warm as most of the country is experiencing the first real cold of the year. Jad, did it snow over where you live?
It did, actually.
It did? Wow.
It didn't stick on the ground. It melted pretty fast, but there was a brief flurry of snow earlier this week in Charlotte, North Carolina. Who would have thought?
Yeah, I have flurries here in Atlanta too. And I was genuinely scared for my wife who works in Atlanta because last time an inch of snow fell in Atlanta, there was a snowcalypse, but it didn't stick. So thank God for that. So today, friends, thank you for tuning in. I promise you, even though you might not live in New York City, I think today's conversation is very important for our country, for Christians in general, because today we're going to talk about the election of Zohran Mandani, the new elected mayor of New York City, which was a historic race. And, I want to let you know that we're going to go into and talk about whether or not he's an anti-Semite, what is his platform, how do the Jewish people feel about him, and then please stick with us to the end, because I'm going to submit to you that he is a priest of a false religion that we Christians need to be aware of and see it as such. It's a religion, it's a faith system, and it's a very dangerous one. So stick with us. Josiah, as always, we want to start with you. Thank you so much for bringing this topic today. Let's start talking about who is this guy. This guy is barely older than me. Who is Mandani and how did he win this election in New York City, the capital of the world?
That's a great question. You're right. He's not that much older than you, Sebastian. It does maybe raise some interesting questions about what happened to you in your student government career. You could have been Mamdani, right? But things took a different turn for you. Now, he's a very interesting character. He's about 34 years old, so he is obviously very young. His background is primarily in politics. He's been involved since college in different kinds of activism or politics. He's been involved in some state politics in New York, and then more recently, obviously, ran for and won the office of mayor of New York City. His background is, I think, a pretty interesting story because he comes from such a varied background, if you will. He has parents of Indian descent. One of them is a Muslim, one of them is a Hindu. Would love to know how conversations at the dinner table went in that context, because that is a bit surprising, but I'm sure it made his upbringing rather fascinating. He spent quite a bit of time growing up in Uganda as well, so he actually holds citizenship both in the United States and in Uganda. So he's a person who considers himself to be a Muslim. He sort of has followed his father's path in that regard. But he also has this background in which he claims to identify as Indian to a certain degree, as Ugandan, as an American, again, as a Muslim, all of these different things, which is just a fascinating hodgepodge of different identities that shape who he is or how he sees himself, I suppose. You also have his attachment to, relatively young age, the politics of the Democratic Socialist Party, which is not really a party that you see running for office on a very regular basis. It's more so it's sort of this grassroots organization. But he ran as a Democratic Socialist and claims the mantle of that organization, which has a lot to do with his politics. Obviously, if you think about what defines that very progressive wing of the American left, the types of things that you're going to hear a lot of have to do with, of course, various kinds of socialism. He made a lot of promises during the campaign that sound a lot like socialism. But you're also going to hear a lot of language about this victim versus oppressor sort of paradigm that he views politics through, and the importance of minorities especially being able to overcome the oppression that they have experienced through a variety of means. And he's going to apply this to not just Israel, and he has very strong opinions about that, but really everything that he puts on a table as a political issue he cares about is going to be fed through this paradigm, which I'm sure we'll discuss a bit more later on. I think it's the best way to summarize it, though, is that he thinks of himself as something of a revolutionary. He is very young, passionate, energetic, and I think does like to style himself or use the language that you would traditionally associate with something of a revolutionary or pretty radical viewpoint. It's pretty surprising that this won in New York City, but I think if you think about the reasons why, it's actually not that hard to understand why something that sounds so radical actually worked and allowed him to become the mayor. Number one, his field of opponents was very weak. You
Yeah.
have Eric Adams, who had his own political scandals. You had the former Governor Cuomo, who has a list of corruption or scandalous things on his tab. At this point, his reputation has been sullied fairly significantly. You have a Republican who had absolutely no chance of winning the election, but insisted on staying in the race despite calls for him to drop out and bolster one of the other candidates to defeat Mamdani. So if you look at who ran against him, it's pretty pathetic, honestly. It was not a very competitive field. And so that certainly gave him a leg up. You also have, I think, this unique ability that he had. I mean, if you look at his campaign, objectively speaking, he's a very talented politician. He knows how to put his finger on the issues that people really care about the most. And he knows how to then communicate how he understands those issues, or the fact that he's able to empathize with a certain set of issues. Affordability really became the big thing he picked up on. If you think about what really matters to the average citizen of New York, it's not necessarily some of the issues that other candidates were running on. It's very day-to-day issues like affordability, being able to find a job, being able to rely on public services, being able to find housing, being able to afford groceries. And his solutions are rather impractical to most of those things. But what he did do, I think, better than some of the other candidates was put his finger on what people actually care about and meet them there. So that, I think, is a little bit of what made him effective, despite some of the things that would make you raise your eyebrows and go, really? That's surprising that he was able to actually become mayor of New York City.
Yeah, man, my mind is going a different ways. Let me say something real quick about something that I wasn't planning on saying, but you triggered me to say about this leadership crisis that we are having. How the most important city in America after Washington D.C. because of politics, but this one, economically speaking, is the most important culturally, is the city that everybody in the world wants to come visit, New York City. And the best candidates that they could have is this 34-year-old nobody who hasn't had any real experience in the real world, and a bunch of corrupt politicians. Cuomo, really, really bad background. Mayor Adams, like, I think Trump pardoned him because he was going to jail otherwise. So this reminds me of 2016, how the best people that we could get in the biggest, most powerful country in the world, the United States, to run for president were Hillary Clinton, no comment, and Donald Trump, a guy who just came out of nowhere, right? What I'm trying to highlight is, where are the Eisenhowers? Where are those like true leaders who have done something for their country, who have served the nation, who have sacrificed their lives for this country, and then because of that, they can lead us? What we have right now is really slim pickings as far as leaders go. That's terrifying to me. And just to clarify, Josiah, isn't it right that he's only held the position of like a city council, the alderman or assemblyman, whatever they call it, and then state assemblyman, and that's it, right?
As far as his experience in elected office, yeah, to my knowledge,
Right.
that would be it. And he's not like he's had a lot of experience outside of that as well. I think is, to your point, people look at his election and they have fair questions about how is he going to run a city the size of a small country with a massive budget, given the lack of any real executive experience he's had, because he has had elected office. So he's not totally unfamiliar with policy issues or the legislative processes, that sort of thing. But it's very different from having leadership experience of any kind in an executive capacity, of which he does not really seem to have any significant or relevant experience. So I think that's one of the other things that's people a little bit confused about. How did he become the mayor?
Yeah. So this leads me to comment on how this is a very personal opinion. I do not respect or I don't appreciate people who never had a real job and all they've done is politics. Like if you guys listen to the first episode of this podcast, you'll learn my background that in student government, I was one of these socialist woke people and the student government. And my dream was just to be in politics for the sake of being in politics. And that's really bad. Like there's a conference that they do every year in Washington, D.C. of all the president of the student government of the country. They fly us in, they pay for it. We go to the White House. At that time, we went to the Obama White House, and they're just talking about like, how are we the big deal that year was transgender bathrooms. So we all commit, like, we're going to fight for this on our campuses. And talking to those people around there, like, it was so sad for me later on to realize how all of this 22, 21, 20-year-old people, all they want to do is be in politics. Like, what do you want to do? Oh, I want to be a governor. I want to be a senator. I want to run for president. And I think that's a bad goal to have in life. I think we can have a country where people's highest aspiration is just to never have a real job, to never know what it's like to work for a paycheck. There is a candidate here in Georgia, Stacey Abrams, who ran for office, who ran for governor. She's never had any real job ever. Her only real job is that she wrote erotica books, and that's it. And she wanted to be our governor. As a person who has to work for a living, to me, that's really scary. So anyways, that's not the point. We're going to put aside now the economic policy. We're going to go to that at the end about how communism, which is the basic economic theory that this guy is preaching, is a false religion. But now let's get into a topic that interests us, passages as friends with the Jewish people, or whether or not this guy is an anti-Semite. There are a lot of accusations about this. There's like a big controversy about it. So let's just check the receipts. Josiah, is he an anti-Semite? Yes or no?
I mean, it certainly says a lot of anti-Semitic things. So I'm gonna give a few examples, and then you can make up your own mind as far as what you think. But in terms of anti-Semitic things that he said, I think there's actually some really interesting things that I've encountered as I've studied both Mamdani, and in the last few weeks, of course, we've been very interested to read about and study what's going on the right with people like Fuentes right now. That's still a major story on the right of American politics right now, or in the conservative movement. And what struck me as rather interesting is that there were some interesting parallels between Mamdani and people like Fuentes as far as the issues that they're drawing to the surface and emphasizing or prioritizing, and the way in which they're turning that in some fairly anti-Semitic directions in the way that they talk about it. So, for example, it's not just Mamdani or the radical left that is emphasizing issues like affordability or housing, the ability to buy a house or the ability to get a job. It's also the far right. If you listen to much of what Fuentes has been going on about recently, it has a lot to do with this as well. And he's going to blame a variety of people. Fuentes is, in addition to the Jews. Mamdani is going to blame a variety of people in addition to the Jews. They're not the same groups that they hold responsible. But the one commonality that they share is that they will at some point scapegoat the Jews or Israel in some way for some of these challenges. They'll find a way to make the scapegoat for some of these problems, Israel or the Jewish people. You'll also find, I think, some commonality in the ways that they intentionally accuse Israel of meddling in American politics and being the corrupting factor that has made our American politics as corrupt or as ineffective as it, frankly, at times it is. But it's rather interesting that they both shared this sort of bent towards, blaming Israel for the fact that our politics don't always work well for us, which I think is an attempt to dodge accountability, and that's not really responsible citizenship, but that's neither here nor there. My point is that there are some common grounds there that I think are very, very interesting. Now, on the flip side, if we think about what makes him unique in terms of the rhetoric that he has been putting out there about Israel and the Jewish people, things that are not necessarily consistent with the far right, but are still very dangerous in their own respect, there's still a pretty long list. So if you go back, for example, and think about his origins, he has always been significantly more revolutionary and progressive on a variety of issues. And that includes Israel's basic right to exist, since a relatively young age. Even in college, as he began to build something of a more public profile, you're seeing these early signs that he is going to consistently be an anti-Zionist or someone who is not a fan of Israel's right to exist. He's not particularly interested in a peace dialogue or peace process, for example, between Israelis and Palestinians. He's more so interested in using some pretty discriminatory language to basically cut Israel out or exclude it from the table and the conversation that's happening. Why do I say that? Well, a few things. If we just look at his track record. Number one, he's very involved in Students for Justice in Palestine while he was in college. If you're not familiar with that organization, there's been a lot of work done since October 7th to unpack who exactly is this organization, where is the funding coming from, and why is it that an organization that claims to not have a national office is acting in such a way in which it appears that every single one of its chapters is very controlled or coordinated, is acting in concert with each other. There's something pretty sinister going on there. And if you dig a little bit deeper into its connections to other organizations that are adjacent to the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, what you're going to find is that it is an organization that shares some common links with organizations like Hamas that are very disturbing. And frankly, it is an organization that supports Hamas and Palestinian terrorism. Not just the Palestinian people, but it supports Palestinian terrorism, which is very dangerous. You're also going to see that Mamdani has, for many years, been advocating for the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which basically is an attempt to argue that rather than engaging Israel in the peace process, what Palestinians really should be doing and what the rest of the world should be doing is just excluding Israel from the international community or international commerce. It should not, quote unquote, collaborate with Israel, but should just cut it out entirely in an effort to isolate it and treat it as a delegitimate entity as he views it to be, or in other words, something that doesn't have a right to exist. So there's a very early track record of this. If you fast forward a little bit and just look at some of the statements that he made, either leading up to the mayoral campaign or even during the campaign, post October 7, I think there were a series of things that were pretty concerning, saying things like, the NYPD is oppressive. Of course, he has very strong feelings about that, but he's going to extend it even a little bit further and say things like the boots of the NYPD are laced up by the IDF.
Yeah,
which basically means right. He blames everything that he perceives to be wrong with the NYPD's relationship with the city and its residents on Israel or the IDF, and he does so primarily because there is a history of post 9/11, the NYPD having officers who consult with the Israelis on how to combat terrorism. So they would conduct joint training exercises on counterterrorism, response to mass casualty events in New York City, that kind of thing. And he's basically saying that is evidence. This shared knowledge with Israel, or these joint training exercises on how to respond to mass casualty events, they are evidence that everything he thinks is wrong with the NYPD is Israel's fault, which is just a crazy thing to say, but he does make these statements on the regular. He also has refused to condemn statements like globalize the Intifada. What does that mean? This is a phrase that came out, especially after October 7, as a way of celebrating what Hamas did on October 7, 2023, and basically arguing that the momentum needed to carry forward and that Hamas couldn't do it by itself. It needed the rest of the community that supported Palestinian terrorism to assist them. And it's a call for violence. I think a lot of people have tried to kind of weasel their way out of this and say, well, it's not really about calling for violence. It's calling about solidarity and these sorts of things. But it really is, given the context in which this term originated and the way that it was used or has been used, it's pretty obvious, I think. It's much more accurate to interpret this as incitement to violence, and yet he's been unwilling to condemn the use of phrases like that. So you've got all kinds of examples like this. We could go on and on. He's also threatened to arrest the prime minister of Israel or other leaders if they try to visit New York, to visit the UN. And his argument is that Israel's committing a genocide. They can't visit our city without me arresting them. Jurisdiction questions aside, because I think that's pretty ludicrous that he thinks that's his responsibility. But the implications of that are that, again, Israel is not allowed to participate in the international community. He thinks that it must be treated as a pariah that doesn't have any right to be a member of the international community. And if they try to, for example, visit New York so that they can visit the UN, he's going to have them arrested. So if you add it all up in total, I think any of these issues in isolation, he could try to explain away. But in total, the sum of all these parts, they're pretty anti-Semitic. It paints a picture of someone who is, if not intentionally, at least failing to exercise some self-control and prevent himself from speaking in some pretty anti-Semitic ways. If that makes him an anti-Semite, I mean, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have a great answer to that, but again, I would let the audience decide what they think about the evidence in total.
Yeah, it's a tragedy, Josiah and listeners, that there are some cultural movements that make people become more conscious about the way they speak. For instance, in 2020, when there was the killing of George Floyd, or the death of George Floyd, whatever, let me just move on. People became more conscious. Like there was a whole day when people, I think in June, put a black square on their social media, and there was like a best case scenario. There was like people became more conscious about like the awareness that there is racism and we should strive to fight racism and to not be racist, and that if there's injustice, we should correct it. Or, for instance, the Me Too movement that at its best has created a culture where men don't feel comfortable harassing women as they probably did back in the day. Like, this is a movement that has made people more conscious of the situation. Like any other issue in the world, the consequences of awareness is that people become more conscious to be more careful. This issue, the issue of the Israeli war against Hamas since 2023, since Israel was attacked by Hamas, has had the opposite effect. People actually have become normalized. They normalized the phrase globalize the intifada. So intifada is the terrorism and the attack of Jewish people, which happened in the early 2000s, the second intifada, which happened on October 7th. And as a result of this, the largest murder, slaughter of Jewish people since the Holocaust in a single day, people didn't become more conscious and more aware of anti-Semitism. They normalize phrases like this, normalize the intifada. And he's one of them. So I think his view, like, there's one issue that demonstrates this very easily. He was asked in an interview, this is a Times of Israel article that shows a video of an interview that he did on Fox News. And they asked him, do you believe that Hamas, they asked Mandani, Zohran Mandani, they asked him, do you think Hamas should lay down their weapons? And he says, I don't really have an opinion about the future of Hamas beyond the question of justice and safety, blah, blah, blah. So this is the guy who's officially now going to be the mayor of the biggest Jewish city in the world. And when it comes to the group that committed the greatest killing of Jewish people in one day since World War II, he says, I don't really have an opinion on them having guns. Ironically, he's very much anti-guns in other scenarios. I have here some tweets, and we're going to talk about some of his tweets later. He has tweeted in the past, in May 2022, he tweeted, we need to ban all guns. Before that, he says that he wanted to have a nationwide ban on assault rifles, and he wants to prevent handguns from being turned into machine guns. So he's against guns, except when they're being held by terrorists. Now, to be fair to him, the day after that interview where he said, I don't really have an opinion, he backtracked. He said, yes, I believe that Hamas should put down their weapons. But that was not after the backlash. So, Josiah, I think Jewish people are alarmed in New York City, a lot of Jewish people, but it seems like not all of them, because it seems like at least 1/3 of them still voted for him, the Jewish vote in New York City. Tell us about that. Does the Jewish community actually fear his rise?
I think in general, yes. And what's been really interesting is to track some of the exit results of the election and how people are interpreting them. You can make these numbers say a couple of different things, or tell a couple different stories if you want them to. But you do, I think, have to take a step back and think about the context. New York City is home to the largest Jewish population outside of Israel. It is a very large, vibrant community, very historic community, been there for a very long time. It's really part of the fabric of New York City. And it's generally very difficult to get elected to a citywide office if you don't have a good relationship with the community, because it's been a part of the city for so long and such a prominent part of the city. The fact that 1/3 of the Jewish community supposedly voted for Mamdani, that's not as impressive as it sounds. I mean, ordinarily, the mayor of New York City would have more support than that. It's not that you have to have the Jewish vote in order to get elected. Obviously, Mamdani is proof of that. But typically speaking, historically speaking, the mayor of New York City is going to have a relatively good relationship with the Jewish community and much more support than that. If you think about it in those terms, so the fact that 2/3 of the Jewish community in New York City chose not to vote for Mamdani or had serious issues with him or concerns, then yeah, I think there's evidence that there's something of a broken relationship there, and you have to then dig a little bit deeper and understand, okay, why? What's the issue? Why do they have an issue with him? And if you look a little bit deeper into who are this 1/3 that supposedly supported Mamdani, I think you're probably going to find that they are significantly more progressive. I mean, within the Jewish community of New York, there's a pretty wide spectrum. You have a pretty progressive element to it. You have a relatively conservative element to it. You have particularly a more religiously conservative element to the Jewish community in New York, like the Haredi or the ultra-Orthodox communities. So you have a pretty wide spectrum there. And I think what you're probably going to find is that it's those that are more towards the progressive, or, you know, this quote unquote radical side of the political spectrum that probably are the ones that supported Mamdani. If you look at a lot of the neighborhoods that are more conservative, or at least are more religiously conservative, less secular, more religiously observant, for example, then you're going to find the support for Mamdani in those historic neighborhoods was very, very low, generally speaking. So there's something going on here. And I think what it suggests, before I get into what some of the concerns are, specific concerns that they registered or actually proposed to Mamdani or put in front of him, I think the split between the more secular and the more religiously observant Jewish communities in New York in terms of how they likely voted on Mamdani, it suggests that there's some proof of trends that have been suspected for a while, that if you want to be a Jew and remain active in progressive politics or accepted in progressive circles, then you have to sort of moderate your Jewish identity. You have to evolve or find a way to make your Judaism or your Jewish identity palatable to your progressive friends. And there's certain barriers to entry, or virtue signaling that you have to do in order to make that happen. One example being being very critical of Israel. If you're Jewish and you're not very critical of Israel, it's much harder to be accepted in progressive circles than it was prior to October 7th. And that's disturbing. The fact that you have to compromise your Jewish identity in order to be accepted within certain political circles is in and of itself an issue. I think it's one of the problems that many Jewish people have with someone like Mamdani is the compromises that were required in order to be a part of his coalition. You also have, beyond that, I think, some specific fears about what is quality of life for the Jewish community in a city governed by him going to look like. You have, I think, a few different examples that we can point to in terms of trying to understand what these issues are. I think it was back in August, there was a meeting of many of the prominent rabbis of New York. There's an association, and they sent a delegation to meet with Mamdani before the election. He was only a candidate at the time, and basically tell him, we have concerns. This refusal to condemn the phrase "globalize the Intifada," this linkage between the issues facing our city and Israel, blaming Israel for these issues, this elevation of anti-Zionism as not the main point of your campaign, but a sub-point or a part of your campaign with some of this anti-Israel rhetoric, calls for boycotting Israel and that sort of thing. These are concerning to us as a community, and we would like to hear your response in terms of these things that we consider being anti-Semitic. Will you walk this back, essentially? And he basically said, I'm going to take a stand against anti-Semitism, but I'm not going to walk back the things that you say are anti-Semitic. And that left them with some very real concerns about what's going to happen, because he didn't, for example, say that he was going to remove protection of the city police from synagogues or other Jewish institutions like their schools. But at the same time, it left them with this impression that even if you put a patrol car outside a synagogue, any resident of the city might get the impression that if the mayor is saying anti-Semitic things, then he is implicitly giving them permission to do or say anti-Semitic things, even if he doesn't pull the police from the synagogues, essentially. And it raises the question, like, okay, are the police just there for appearances, or are they actually going to arrest someone if they try to vandalize the synagogue, or if they try to harass or attack someone outside the synagogue? These are the kinds of concerns and fears that they were raising, and they didn't get satisfactory answers to those questions. So at the end of the day, what it really comes down to, I think, is if you're unwilling to change the way that you speak about the Jewish community, can we trust you to actually protect us from people who really do want to harm us or harass us and those sorts of things? And many Jewish people felt like the answer was no. That's why I think a majority of them did not or chose not to vote for Mamdani in this election.
Yeah, what I want to highlight here, friends, is as Christians, we're called to stand with the Jewish people. And what I hope to create in this episode is a sense of sympathy that it's not like, I don't know what the level of alarm is. It's not like crisis mode, but it's a very concerning development. And I'll tell you why. Let me go back to history once again, friends, real quick. Let's talk about Vienna. Vienna is the capital of Austria, which had a anti-Semitic mayor named Karl Lueger from 1897 to 1910. That's when Herzl, this guy right here, in my background, he was working as a journalist in that city. And actually, Haviv Retivgur, in his episode Ask Haviv Anything, he has an entire podcast episode about this. He claims, and many have claimed, that what inspired Herzl was not actually the Dreyfus affair in Paris, but it's actually the anti-Semitic rise of Karl Lueger. So this guy was a very anti-Semitic mayor. I have some quotes from him. He would have been a great guest on Tucker Carlson's podcast. He said quotes like, "The influence of the Jews must be broken if the Austrian people are to live. The Jews are Vienna's misfortune." He says, "We're not against the individual Jew, but against the Jewish poisonous spirit." And finally, he says that our movement stands for Christianity against the domination of Jewish capital. So this sounds a lot like some of these guys like Nick Fuentes, Candace Owens have been saying, or even Kanye West. So this guy, he rose to power on this populist platform, and guess who was living in this city at the same time? Adolf Hitler. He was living there towards the end of the tenure of the mayor of Vienna. Hitler was in Vienna from 1908 to 1913, and in his book, Mein Kampf, he quotes Karl Lueger, and he sees Lueger as an inspiration. Lueger did not call for the extermination of the Jews. That would be Hitler's final solution later on. And final data point here, in 1910, when this mayor stopped his tenure, there were 175,000 Jews. This is data from the Museum of the Jewish People in Israel, now known as ANU. Many of you have been there as passengers sometimes visit this museum, ANU, which means ours. In 1910, there were 175,000 Jews. By the end of World War II, there were 800 Jews left. So I'm not saying here that Mandani is the new Hitler, that he's the new Karl Lueger. I'm just saying that it's the most Jewish city in the world, and a guy who refuses to disavow violence against Jewish people has been elected mayor. And I think Jewish people are very concerned about this. You quoted Josiah about this meeting of the 80 rabbis or 80 Jewish people who met with him, and they were left alarmed from his views in that meeting. And then final point here, 800 rabbis from New York City signed a public letter expressing concern on Mandani's use of the slogan of globalized intifada. That's 800 rabbis from different synagogues in the New York area. That's a lot of rabbis. Yeah. So again, I'm not trying to sound the alarm of like, we are in Vienna 1910, but it's sad. It's sad to see a guy who refuses to disavow this anti-Semitic call for violence. So, Josiah, with that in mind, let's think about how we should respond. Christians, this podcast is not about creating alarm, but how should we respond?
I think there's a couple things that stand out in terms of how we think about politics in general. And maybe I'll share those comments. You can share your thoughts specifically on how you think Christians should respond to Mamdani. But there's two things I would say to come to mind when we think about how to respond to big moments in our political environment or political history as a country. Number one, I think it's important we don't be people of panic. Christians should not be people of panic or scared of what's happening. If we think about this in very practical terms, not just theological terms, I mean, yes, Mamdani represents something very different, potentially something very dangerous, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that he is the new face of the Democratic Party. I think that was something that happened pretty quickly is when he won the election, people then turned and said, okay, he's young. He is now the mayor of the largest city in the United States, and he is now a national figure who's the future of the Democratic Party. Not necessarily. I mean, if you look at the rest of the results from the election the same night, you had relatively, or at least comparatively moderate candidates winning other also fairly significant offices like the governor of New Jersey or governor of Virginia, people who were not saying these very extreme ideas or issuing these anti-Semitic statements were able to also win some pretty important offices. So I think it's just important that we, in both practical terms and in theological terms, are not the kind of people who are going to panic just because of an election result. The second thing I would say from a high-level standpoint about how we react to or respond to political developments is that we should be very, in the words of scripture, sober-minded. I was thinking about this a lot in reading through First Peter. It's pretty striking to me how many times throughout the book of First Peter we're given the instruction to be sober-minded. And if you think about what that means, I mean, the context helps essentially because what is happening as he uses it in different places throughout the book is Peter's reminding us that we should be aware that the world is a hostile place. To be sober-minded means that don't be naive, don't pretend like there are not threats to a biblical worldview or Christian values in the world, because the world is hostile to the way of Jesus. And that's very clear throughout the Bible. We should be aware of that and awake to that reality. We also should not allow that to discourage us. As I just said, like don't panic. To be sober-minded, in the words of Peter, is to be mindful of and to remember the fact that our hope is ultimately in Jesus and in his work. It's not in any election results that happen. Obviously, we care about them because we care about the welfare of our nation and our cities and our fellow citizens. But at the end of the day, they are not our source of ultimate hope. That hope is to be found in the person of Jesus. The last major use of this term sober-minded is just a reminder to be prayerful. I think it's important that we think about this as we read about and contemplate what does this mean for New York City, for the rest of our country. We should be aware that it could be bad. It very well could be very dangerous, and we should not be naive about that. But we don't need to panic. We should remember where our hope is, and we should continue to pray that we remember that hope and that God will continue to work in our government for the good of our country and our fellow citizens.
Yeah, Josiah, thank you for that point. The point that our hope is in Jesus, and that's the truth that we hold to, the gospel. And my final point today is that communism, we should see it as just another false religion. This guy calls himself a democratic socialist. But basically, what he's calling for is the government control of the means of production, the means of employment, the means of food distribution. He wants to have public grocery stores that are government owned, public housing that the government provides you, public paychecks, like everything public, the government owns everything. In fact, in his acceptance speech, he made two quotes that I think highlight his worldview as a Marxist. He said, "There is no problem so big that the government cannot fix." Friends, this is a religion. As Christians, we know that our biggest problem is original sin, the sin that is in our hearts, and the government cannot fix it. You cannot legislate your way into salvation. And this is a misguided religion. The second quote is that today is a new dawn for humanity. He sees his election as a new dawn for humanity. And this is obviously Marxist language, because in Marxism, they see the redemption of the world through the rise of the proletariat that will take over. And original sin is capitalism, is to participate in capitalism. And we need to have a classless society where nobody owns anything, the government owns everything, and Papa government tells you where to work, how much to eat, where to get your food, how to get educated, what to read. It's a religion. It's a false religion. And I think I submit to y'all that unfortunately in this secularized world, especially in America, politics is becoming the main religion of a lot of people. I sincerely feel sad in 2016 and 2020, mostly 2024, when Trump won the election. We all saw those videos of people freaking out on social media and like crying and just they couldn't understand it. And a lot of people on the right wing like would laugh about it. But I was really sad because those people are truly in pain. They truly believe that because Trump won, their lives are over and their dreams are over. And Kamala Harris was the Messiah for them. And this guy, Zohran Mandani, and with this I will end, he went from being a prophet of this false religion to now being a priest. He's now the mediator of salvation through the government. And we know that's not true. Our hope is Jesus. So how we should pray? We should pray that Lord will have mercy, that his term, which I guess is 4 years, isn't it, Josiah?
I think so.
Yeah.
I'm less familiar with New York City politics, I have to admit.
It's not the end of the world. Hopefully he'll come and go and the city will stand and the church will rise. There are good churches and we need good churches in cities like New York City, like Redeemer's Church. Tim Keller's church is a great church in the middle of the city there. So let's pray for the church, for Christians to come out, for us to not panic. And please be mindful that Jewish friends, especially those in New York City, are feeling uneasy about these situations. Josiah, any last words before we go?
No, I don't think so. Thank you for a very good conversation, Sebastian. It's been great to be with you today.
Thank you all for listening. Stay with us. I'm really excited about the travel season coming up this winter. Passages will be going to Israel. Josiah, are you going to Israel this winter?
I am. I'm excited. It'll be good to be back.
It's really exciting. And last little plug, there's another podcast, Discover Your Roots. Josiah, we dropped the first episode for that as well, right?
So season 4 is out and live in the environment. Episode 2 comes out next week.
Please check that out here in this YouTube channel or Spotify or whatever you get your podcast. Thank you for listening to Passages Pulse. We'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.